11:01 Thursday, June 17th of 2021. Here we are, back in the heaven backdrop. I think it might be here to stay. Heaven. Turns out heaven's okay. Give me just a second here to make sure that I am live and streaming. Looks like I am. Looks like I'm good. And now I'm going to go ahead and disregard what's happening. Actually, maybe I'll leave it over here. Okay. It is Thursday, and this is my live broadcast. If you're interested in participating in this live Thursday broadcast, it is meant as a time to talk about artwork, your artwork. If you would like to submit images for me to take a look at and discuss, critique, you can submit those images to Dabbleon, that's Dabbleon.com. Dabbleon, Dabbleon at gmail.com. So send me images, and if there's something in particular that you're getting hung up on, something that you want specific feedback about, or just kind of an initial response to, this would be a good way to do that. And let me know in your email what you would like me to talk about, or just send it and see what my initial responses are. I love talking about artwork. I'd love to take a look at what you're up to. And ideally, this would be a time to talk about either works that are currently in process, works in progress, or a work that you recently finished. Last week, I talked about, I spent a pretty good amount of time talking about the byproducts or the effects of lenses and photography. In the way that those things and those technologies inform our aesthetic and also our perception of the world around us, right? So there are some effects like depth of field that have to do with just how a lens, how a camera lens bends light and focuses it, right? This ties into some things that happen naturally in our eye and how we focus, our eye focuses on things, and things that we focus are sharp and things that are not in that range of focus are blurry, right? So I talked a lot about how different photographic effects can inform our aesthetic and our sense of perception, right? How we perceive the world, how we interact with it, interpret it, and also function in it, right? And then the more we're exposed to to photographic imagery, whether it be in video or still photography online or in the world around us on print media, the more that starts to get to influence just our day-to-day operations, our day-to-day functioning. And it creeps in, obviously, to artwork, right? And it becomes another tool for us to be aware of and to use intentionally to strengthen whatever it is we're trying to accomplish in our artwork, right? So we can play with that sense of focus and depth of field by making the background even more blurry, or blurry in a painting where maybe that's not necessarily how we see it, but we can use that to communicate to the viewer that sense of depth of field or of focus, right? Even if it's not literally what's happening in our reference, either what we're looking at or, even a photo reference. So we can do things to tap into that aesthetic, to tap into those, those visual norms that we're all kind of on the same page about, to strengthen or make our visual communication more interesting. So I got thinking about some of the things that I was saying last week, and I probably was a little bit too complicated in how I was representing it. And I thought today maybe I would just take, I'm going to try to keep it a little bit on the shorter side. I'll probably try not to make it quite as long as I did last week. But I wanted to focus in on just one aspect of those photo effects, those lens effects that I was talking about, and just zero in on sharp edges and soft edges. Sharp edges and soft edges, and how they affect our how we read imagery, how we read visual language, and how we can use the sharp edges and soft edges as an artist to make our images more legible, to clarify or strengthen what it is that our image is about, right? And also, I think it's a very useful kind of lens to, sorry, bad pun. Also a useful tool to use when we're trying to gauge what's successful or what's working and not working in our compositions, right? Just looking at our edges, hard edges, soft edges. And what I want to, before we start looking at some images here, I wanted to, I guess, just reiterate, right? So hard edges are going to tap into our sense of focus, right? Things that tend to be sharper seem like they are more in focus, right? So they are communicating to us that this is something that's worth paying attention to. As an artist, when I make a sharp edge, I'm communicating to my viewer that this is what I want you to focus on, right? Even if it's not an important part of your image, that's the kind of mechanism you're tapping into when you're making your image, right? So it could be that everything's sharp, right? Which is fine. But again, it's undeniable that like a hard edge is going to kind of grab our attention more so or in a different way perhaps than a soft edge, right? So I'm trying to keep this as kind of general as possible, just to try to be clear how I'm evaluating these images or thinking about it. Okay, so we're going to look at, I basically just typed into Instagram paintings, so the hashtag paintings, and I chose, let's see, 5 or 6 different examples of images, paintings that I thought might be worth looking at through this lens of hard edges and soft edges and what they're doing. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my computer screen here, and I'm in Photoshop. Let's tap in. Okay. Also, kind of a practical thing to address is that some media, like watercolor, oil paint, acrylic, some media that we use when we're painting are naturally going to produce hard edges and soft edges, right? So just the mechanical nature, what's going on with the actual medium itself will can unintentionally introduce hard edges and soft edges, and we need to be aware of that as a characteristic of whatever medium of choice that we're using at the time, right? So for example, watercolor, if water is on your paper, can be very soft, create very soft edges, very fluid transitions and gradients, right? But if there's no water on the paper and you start painting with watercolor, say a line, water can make very sharp, almost like hyper sharp, because the pigment can sometimes kind of gather at the edges of that dome of water, that tube of water that we paint with. The pigment can kind of gravitate toward those edges, and when it dries or absorbs into the paper, we almost have a very subtle outline, like a harder line along some of those painted edges with watercolor. So with watercolor, you can kind of get the extremes of both. You can get extreme hard edges if you're painting with like a fine detail brush and the paper is dry. And then with watercolor, you can also get the extreme of soft edges where, if you do a wet into wet, that the water is going to carry the pigment and blend it between 2 different areas of wet paint or water. With acrylic paint, if you're using heavy body acrylic paint, because it dries so quickly, you're going to tend to get really sharp edges, right? And a lot of texture if you're, again, using the heavy body. Because you just literally don't have very much time to blend wet into wet. It dries, right? So even when you're trying to blend, if you wait too long, you're going to notice that you get a lot of kind of dry, brushy, scratchy kinds of transitions from one area of color to the other, right? It's only going to blend if it's wet into wet. So with acrylic, you tend to get a lot more sharp edges. And then with oil, it's kind of somewhere in between, right? With oil, the luxury is that it's not going to dry. So you can go back at any point and decide that you want to just smudge an edge and blur it a little bit, where you just don't have that kind of time window with acrylic. All right, so let's take a look at this painting. It looks to me like this, well, I'm guessing that this is oil paint. Again, when I look at a painting and trying to gauge what medium is being used, actually a lot of my calculation has to do with the kinds of edges I see, the sharp edges and smooth edges. So when I start to see edges like this, I look along this and I see that parts of this are sharp and parts of it are kind of blended and scratchy. But really, I don't see a lot of that kind of characteristic dry, brushy, sharp, choppy edges that you tend to get with acrylic. So I'm going to guess that this is oil. The other way that I'm guessing that this is oil is with this drip in the background, where there's kind of a characteristic drip that oil paint makes when you put too much solvent in. So your terpenoid or whatever solvent you're using, when you just dump a bunch of solvent or put a bunch of solvent in your brush and start painting with it, it drips in this kind of very characteristic way. So my guess is that this is oil paint, at least the top coat. And we've got a lot of nice impasto. So again, we're looking through the lens of hard edges, sharp edges, and soft edges. In this case, the thing that I wanted to point out here is this little this drip in the background. So this drip, because that's solvent, it's actually kind of cutting through the paint. It's a solvent, it's dissolving it or kind of loosening it up, and it's creating these hard edges, the hard-edged lines straight down here. And as I totally get it, that's a seductive thing when we see this kind of drippy, broken, veiny kind of lines. But in this case, that hard edge is tapping into this sense of focus, right? It's grabbing our attention. It's a hard edge. It's in focus. It's important, right? That all that machinery in our mind is going off. And I find myself going straight to that because those edges are a lot more detailed and resolved and hard and sharp, focused, than any kind of level of detail we get in the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, right? So if we were to take that out, which maybe I'll do in just a second, we would be less likely to go over to this corner and more likely to spend time on the eyes, nose, and mouth, which is kind of where I feel like the artist is wanting us, where they're wanting us to spend time, right? That besides that little drip over here, this is kind of the most attractive for a variety of reasons, right? That she's making eye contact. There's high contrast with this dark hair and dark background with the light skin. The blue eyes or green eyes are a nice complementary contrast to the orange, red oranges of the skin and pinks. You've got this blue sweater that's also a contrast to these oranges, yellow oranges, or red oranges in the skin tones. And then the hair, this dark hair, gets lost almost entirely in the background. So everything kind of leads us to this face, but then there's this sharp edges of this drip in the background that I think is just was not a very well thought through idea. I think, again, it's like you're in the moment, you see this drippy thing, that's kind of a cool texture, but unintentionally you're tapping into our sense of, how we judge what's important in an image, and you're telling us that we need to pay attention there when really that's not, it should not be pulling our attention away from what the primary focal point or primary subject matter is. So let's see what happens if let's see, take the blur tool, and what if I just take that, again, I'm just kind of making that a little bit blurrier, and hopefully you can kind of see the effect here. So with that blurry, I'm telling the viewer that this is not in focus. This is not important, right? So it's literally not a focal point. And I want you not to be spending all your time there. I want you to be spending your time here in the areas with the sharper edges that are in focus, and that's what's more important. All right, so there's other things that I could say about this image in terms of how edges are being used. Again, there's not very much contrast or separation or sharp edges between the hair and the background, which makes the hair kind of dissolve into the background, which is kind of nice because it creates a connection between the subject matter, this person, and the context or the environment that they're in. Kind of creates a nice transition between subject and ground. And then you have the edges of this sweater that get kind of broken up in some nice ways along the edge, so it's not very sharp and graphic. And again, that kind of broken up edge helps to connect the figure with the context. If it was a really precise, sharp outline, it would start to feel cut out and not as integrated with the background. And I got some more examples of other images that do that same thing. But here, my primary thing that I wanted to point out was this drip in the background unintentionally creating a focal point or grabbing our attention because it is significantly more sharp-edged and detailed and resolved than the kinds of marks that are in the face. Okay, let's move on here. So I saw this image, and there's some nice soft edges up in the clouds. You've got hard edges with these the little stars, little dots. So there's nice soft and hard little focal points, a lot of interesting information going on up there. We've got nice hard edges happening in the hair, and just selectively, not all the hair, but there's some nice hard edges, especially here in this strip of hair that's the highlight. And that guides us up in a really interesting, dramatic way into this distance, into the heavens, accentuating the direction of the gaze, or the focus of the person in the image. So a lot of really nice things happening here in terms of hard edges and sharp edges. What I noticed, though, is that my eye keeps on wanting to go over here along the neck and the shoulder on the right, because I've got this point of high contrast, and it's a very sharp edge, right? So over here on the shoulder, part of the shoulder right here, as we get away from that point of highest contrast into this area, it starts to get a little bit soft, which is nice. It connects it to the background. It creates kind of a sense of that depth of field where it starts to get a little bit blurry. But then I get this sharp edge right here with high contrast and much less of that kind of blurriness. So in this case, just like I did before, if I were to take the blur tool and just artificially, actually I'm going to take my brush down a little bit and artificially blur that edge a bit so it's more in line with the rest of this blurriness on top of the shoulder. And maybe I need to do a before and after so you can see more clearly. I'm going to duplicate that layer. All right, so I'm going to go back and blur that edge a bit. All right, so now this is blurred and this is unblurred, right? So in this case, I think that if we were to bring that blur that's at the top of the shoulder right here and just extend it down to the bottom of the shoulder here so that it's blurry all the way down, it's going to help tap into the sense of space, like that shoulder is out of the depth of field. It's out of that range that's going to remain in focus. So it's going to create a greater sense of space and depth in the image. It's also going to not grab our attention to that really high contrast area of the image and let us spend more time in these other sharp edges that are guiding us up into the sky, which is kind of more the point. I don't want my eye to be grabbed back down to this part of the shoulder. And perhaps it could even be said that maybe just a touch of blurriness even along that neck and top of the shoulders there. Just soften that just a touch. Again, doing so is going to de-emphasize that area, take it out of this position of priority, right, where we want to focus on the things that look sharp and in focus, and help us to spend more time or give more of our attention to these lines that are sharp and guiding us up into the image, right? So again, there's a lot of different ways we can just refine or polish our image, clarify what's important and where the viewer should be looking just by making some slight adjustments to how hard or soft edges are. Anyway, this is a nice image. I'm going to move on to the next one. So in this one, I thought it was kind of an interesting example because we got a lot of soft edges. This looks like it might have been digitally rendered. Actually, maybe not. I kind of at the bottom see maybe an easel, but it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. The digital tools now are getting pretty good at mimicking other physical media. So in this case, a lot of soft edges, right? And that's part of the aesthetic is the softness of these edges. But I want you just to look at this and try to gauge where your eyes are going. Where are your eyes being pulled? They're going to be pulled to high contrast, right? That's always going to be a big, big part of how we interpret or read images. High contrast. So I'm going to go over here to this really light. Let me see if I can. You can't see where I'm pointing because I don't have a cursor up there. All right, let me see if I can get something up there that will show you where I'm looking. All right. I'm going to move that up. Okay, so this area right up there, it's high contrast. You got dark next to really light, and also that's a sharp edge, right? That sharp edge undoubtedly is part of what's grabbing our attention up there. It's the high contrast and also the sharp edge. We've got edges in here that are much sharper along the hair than you get here in the eyes, nose, and mouth, right? So my eye's jumping around kind of between this area, and this area, because those are the areas of highest contrast and the sharpest edges. Everything else is kind of this soft, scratchy, brushy, smooth type of rendering, and is not going to be as impactful. So notice how, you really don't go too much to the eye, even though that's fairly central in the composition, and we're naturally going to be predisposed to finding eyes, right? That's a pattern that we're really sensitive to because psychologically, it makes sense that we communicate a lot with our eyes. But in this image, I don't really go there, even though that's high contrast, right? You've got these high contrast between highlight and shadow, and this is relatively sharp right there. But again, my eye's going over here where there's this texture. It's not just the edges of those marks. It's the actual texture that's more, it looks like it's more resolved, like it's more in focus. All right, so that in this case, it doesn't bother me too much. It is a little bit distracting. I kind of want to have my attention more locked in on the face. I feel that that's what the artist would like me to do, but I'm kind of getting pulled over to these areas. So maybe, I would just knock down the sharpness of those marks, or bring something a little bit sharper into some of these facial features to help kind of communicate to me that that's where my attention not to be ending up. This is what's of primary importance. Right? Okay, so let's move on to the next one. This one I thought was particularly good. So I don't know, it might be intentional. It might just be a good intuition. I don't know for sure. This is, I would guess, oil paint just based on how these edges have that kind of a nice range of blur to sharp edges, and you couldn't get these kinds of mixing without wet into wet. And it's hard to keep acrylic wet enough, long enough for these kinds of marks to happen organically, over the course of a painting. So my guess is, this definitely looks like oil. All right, so notice where the artist chooses to have the sharpest edges. Where are the sharpest edges? It's partially about contrast for sure. I don't want to minimize the importance of contrast here, right? So the artist could have brought this really dark black value into some areas of the hair. In fact, my suspicion is that especially down here behind the ear, there would have been punctuations of really dark black value. But these values in the hair, even in the shadows, especially kind of right below the ear, or right here where this curve of hair goes behind the ear, they never get as dark as the black around the eye or the pupil on the eye or this dark shadow up here, right? So contrast is being used in a masterful way here, but also notice how soft the edges were made, how much this was blurred out along the edge of the hair. It gets a little hard right in there. How soft these edges are between the skin of the face and the hairline, right? All the way across here. And then, all right, hold on just a second. Just a second. Third week in a row, babe. gosh, third week in a row. I just apologize. Um, all right, so we had some kids wanting to come in to get bikes. All right, let me see if I can get my train of thought back on. Okay, so notice how some of these areas are so soft between the hair and the skin, between the back of the head and the hair in the background, and then just these little punctuations of this sharpness right around the eye especially. It's almost the only line in the whole image that gets to be that sharp, right? Just that eyelid right there, or the eyelashes right there. And maybe over here on these eyelashes right there. So in the eyes, those are the points of the sharpest edges and the most value contrast, right? So in this case, I think I wouldn't change a thing. These are fantastic edges used to their best effect, right? So there's not much of that shallow depth of field thing going on here. That's not really what's being tied into. It's just that, but it kind of is actually. You know, it's like when those sharp edges really grab our attention because we're so in tune visually to prioritize things that seem to be resolved or in focus, and we recognize them. We're going to lock in on that. So by just kind of obscuring these edges and softening and obscuring the kind of detailed information that's included in the rest of the image, and just allowing this to get just slightly more detailed than everything else, more resolved, sharper, more detailed information, really is effective in getting us to lock in on that and making it all the more powerful by that contrast. All right, so moving on. So this is an example of watercolor. We can see both extremes, right? So we can see areas up here in the skin tones where there are these wonderfully soft gradations and transitions from one area of color to another. And then also we get this other thing that happens with watercolor where you can see there are these almost hyper sharp edges kind of along here, especially in the back of the hair and some of these strands of hair. So watercolor is fantastic in that regard. You get this really nice range and ability to control how sharp or soft edges, and you can get a really nice range of hardness and sharpness, or sharpness and blurriness or softness. But if you're not careful, it can work against you. You got to be intentional about it and conscious of it. So looking at this, my eye's going to be attracted to or try to lock in and focus on the areas that are sharpest edge and highest contrast. So notice how your eye is going to the hair, back here especially where it's the sharpest edges and highest contrast. It softens up a little bit here at the top where the contrast is less, and you get some kind of blurriness in the blue strands up here, some soft transitions between different shades of blue. So in this case, you know, there's some nice stuff happening, but I feel my eye kind of flicking around to disparate parts of the image, trying to find where I should lock in on. What is in focus? What ought my eye be paying attention to? The back of the head, the eyes, all this kind of sharp detail happening in the strands of hair. I start to get some sharpness in these edges in the ear, in the nose. There's this sharp edge down here at the bottom, kind of the nostril. So, you know, it doesn't take much. A little point of high contrast and sharp edge, just like we talked about in this image right before, just that little tiny suggestion of a sharp edge at high contrast is enough to really zap us, to grab our attention and make that point really compelling. Well, when you have those little moments all over the image, it then starts to be counterproductive, right? We're starting to kind of get pulled in a lot of different directions. So in this case, I'm going to grab the blur tool here, and let's see, blur. I would soften up at the very least this top of the shoulder. Let that connect with the background, right? So when you're rendering with watercolor, instead of picking up the skin tone and going on to a dry piece of paper, just run a little, use a mop brush, or a wide brush, and run a little bit of water along that edge. Maybe even let it dry a little bit so it's not sopping wet, and then run your skin tone along there, block in that area of skin tone, and let that edge just soften a lot, right? Or if you notice that that edge is too hard when you put that skin tone down, go along the edge with a damp brush and again, just help soften that edge just a little bit so it's not going to ultimately grab our attention. I would do the same elsewhere in the image, going into places and just choosing areas to soften edges and probably also bring down contrast so that they don't grab our attention quite so much, right? See, did you see that? How just softening that lip right there. I should do a before and after again, so I'm going to pull that down. Right, so that you've got it, especially down here, kind of at this front edge of the bottom lip, there's kind of an intense corner right there. So if I just soften that a little bit, and maybe here in the background where the face kind of curves around, that's one less little spot where my eye's going to be caught on, right? Maybe I do want the lips to be a primary focal point. So maybe I do leave these teeth really sharp and the top lip really sharp. But I don't know, I would go in and probably blur at least the bottom edge of this nostril. Maybe the top edge makes more sense to have sharp. But the bottom edge of the nostril, I've just softened that a bit. Let's do it before and after, right? And that's going to, again, one less little tiny point of high contrast and sharp edge that's going to try to pull my attention and confuse what's of primary interest. So even those two start to make this feel a lot more comfortable to me. Or I guess I got the shoulder, the front of the bottom lip here, and then that little black dot in the nostril. That does a lot, and now I'm noticing that I can just lock in a little bit better on the red lips, and then these dark, more detailed kind of eyebrows and the detail of the eye. That all becomes more important by de-emphasizing those other areas that were kind of pulling on my attention. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit before and after. So this is with the softening edges, and this is with the lip and the nostril. Back to those hard edges. Hard edges, soft edges. All right, so a little bit of refinement. Okay, I don't need, I think I've probably made my point, but looking at this image, this looks like acrylic, and you can see these kind of characteristic sharp edges, and even the places where attempts were made at blending, you can see the texture of the canvas or whatever, maybe a canvas paper, a canvas pad that was being used, and that's because the paint is just not wet, and you're doing wet on dry, so it's going to pick up the texture of the canvas more and have sharper edges, right? So that's a limitation of the medium you're using. A lot of the choppiness in the ocean. Just notice how you get a lot more of these sharp edges happening because the paint's dry, and you're trying to blend wet into dry, and wet into dry is always you're not going to get that smooth blend between color. So in this case, I would say these hard edges along the back are kind of perhaps overly distracting, or could be softened. Maybe up here, right along the I'm forgetting what the name of that bone is right there, but leaving that hard where there's a hard transition or kind of a bump right there, a sharper edge bump, and then these areas down here in the back where there's going to be a more rounded transition, a more kind of form shadow that's happening along from highlight to shadow. And again, I have a feeling that these edges are mostly hard just because it's acrylic and it's hard to do It's hard to do wet into wet blending, but you can see how just softening that helps to make the anatomy feel less angular, right? So there's not like a sharp crease in her back. It's more of a smooth, gradual, round curve as the back kind of curves away from the light source. And then here too, I'd probably just soften that up a little bit. And then over here, we've got these hard edges happening with the texture, the impasto happening, and then some of the hard edges in the ocean. You can just see how, again, it's this, some hard, some soft. I'm not quite sure what's supposed to be in focus, and that unintentional emphasis is being placed on these areas because it's tapping into our sense of what's in focus and what we should be paying attention to. All right. Anyway, I don't think I need to go into that too much. This, just lovely, right? Notice how soft these edges along the top of the shoulder, to the point where we lose the distinction between the shirt and the background almost entirely, as it kind of just blends into there. So that helps to tie the figure to the ground, helps integrate the sense of light and space, helps attach the figure more completely into that space. But also, those soft edges really make these hard edges and these more resolved features pop, right? And look at the face. Even in the face, we got the hair. Look at how soft those edges are. If this were a photograph, those would be just as sharp and in focus as the edges around the eye and the mouth and the nose, right? But the artist intentionally left these areas much softer to make the eyes, nose, and mouth pop, right? So again, it's not accurate to what we would experience in real life, or it's not accurate to what how a photograph would render this same scene, but it's tapping into some of those that occur in photography, right? When it's soft, it's not in focus. It's not something we need to pay attention to, right? So we can use that, or use that artificially. We can add softness where it wouldn't normally be soft in our visual experience in the real world, to communicate or clarify what's important, what's not important. All right, you get what I'm saying. I think one more example here, and then I'll be done. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but you can kind of see how sharp edges are pulling sharp edges in high contrast, pulling my attention down to the feet down here at the bottom. The signature at the bottom right, that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, is when the signature becomes a focal point. Like, I don't know. I don't sign a lot of my paintings for that reason. Like, I don't want you to look at my signature. I want you to look at the painting. So I don't know. Just be cognizant of that. Like, make the signature less contrasty, less sharp edged. All right, it becomes part of your composition, and to me, not a good thing. All right, so notice how we got one soft eye here, one sharp eye, but over here, two sharp eyes, sharp nose. The nice softness of the tail, but again, it's like there's not a really cohesive plan or pattern in how hard edges and soft edges are being used, and my eye gets kind of confused, jumping around between hard edges and soft edges, not knowing exactly what the artist intends as a primary focal point, or how to order areas of priority in, as far as what I'm going to give my attention to. So interesting to think of this image in terms of hard and soft edges. In this case, I thought it was kind of interesting that this artist chose to make this back edge soft and this edge right here along the cheek hard. I think my intuition would have been to reverse that, to make this back edge sharp and to make this soft, because this edge is right in the center of the composition, and I'm already going to be really locked in on that. And I don't know, I think it's kind of distracting how this is emphasized right here. And I'd want maybe more definition along that back cheek, and this to feel softer. And maybe that's just like also a skin thing. Like I want the facial skin to feel like there's more of a roundness or softness. And I don't know, some of this information down at the bottom, soft edges, hard edges, feels a little bit chaotic and doesn't resolve very well. So there's a lot of really nice graphic things happening here, with soft edges and hard edges, especially in this background, these colors in the background. But it feels a little bit clunky, and specifically in how hard edges and soft edges are being used to guide my attention. I would make different decisions here. That's not a very nice thing to say. Hopefully, I'm saying I'm not coming across as too critical of these things. These are all just decisions, right? And how we're choosing to use these visual cues. This I thought was very interesting. Notice how in the foreground we've got a lot of really sharp edges, a lot of resolution and detail. And interestingly enough, a lot of those lines and sharp edges are similar in contrast and size to the sharp edges and lines in the background. These are more organic and kind of at angles and diagonals, where these are vertical. But in terms of their size, the width of the actual line, height, length, they very much mimic or tie into what's happening in these steeples in the high contrast in the background. And even in the background, notice that on the left here and on the right, those details in the trees, a lot of softer edges, a lot less contrast. And then you get these little details here in the church. These doors and windows are sharper edged. The steeples, these are sharper edged. And this is a lot sharper edged than the other information that you see in the rest of the image, even in that the same distance, right? So hard edges and hard edges and soft edges are being very intentionally used and very judiciously used to really emphasize what is of primary importance and what we're supposed to understand from this image. I'm not going to get too much into that. I think I've kind of already made my point. The last one that I wanted to talk about here was this one. I just thought it was so lovely. Notice how, we generally would want to go to the face and specifically to the eyes, but this guy's sleeping, right? It's not really we're not going to make eye contact. His eyes are closed. So all the marks here in the face that have to do with the eyes are much softer and blurrier and obscured. Notice that, there are a few little sharp edge details in the clothing and the hands, but mostly it's just really soft. The edges along the cloak in the background, very soft. Very judicious use of these sharp edges and details. A little bit on the nose right here, and the eyeglasses. Right, there's a little thin, sharp line. Right, it doesn't even go all the way around the lens, and little blips of the same detail in the left, and that's enough to kind of lock us in on this face to give it character, but not to keep us from moving around the rest of the image, right? There's a larger story being told. I'm picking up sharp edges and information here in this teacup and in this vase, right? So there's this interesting dynamic where I'm kind of jumping between this vase or urn or whatever that is, the teacup, and then the kind of details here in the glasses, nose, and mouth, right? It's kind of a triangular energy happening between those three things. Whereas if the artist had chosen to include more sharp edges in the eyes and in the hair and more detail and resolution up here, I would be less apt to go around and look at other parts of the image, right? All right, so I think that's probably well overkill on examples of what I'm talking about. But I think well worth thinking about. Think about hard edges and I keep on saying hard edges and sharp edges. Sharp edges and blurry edges, or sharp and soft, hard and soft edges, and how and what they communicate to your viewer. Are they unintentionally creating focal points or distracting attention away from what you want your viewer to look at, right? Could you soften edges or harden edges to clarify what the image is about, even if that's not actually what you see? These are decisions that we can make, right? We have the ability or creative license to make adjustments to what we're seeing and what we're trying to represent to clarify or make our visual statement more compelling or clear. So as you are making your paintings, I think it's well worth going in and just looking at your image and evaluating in terms of hard edges and soft edges. And I think that's it. That's all I'm going to cover in this broadcast. I have a mixed media figure drawing workshop happening next week at my studio in Santa Monica. There are still 2 spots open. I'd love to have you join. It's mixed media, so we're going to be looking at ways to render and interpret the figure that aren't your traditional charcoal on paper. So if you're interested in that, you can register at dabbleon.com, dabbleon.com/workshops. dabbleon.com/workshops. And then I think in 3 or 4 weeks, there will be another workshop, mixed media abstraction. And again, looking at using a combination of materials, looking at integrating materials at the service of abstract imagery. We're going to be talking about some artists that do that successfully, and experimenting with ways that you can include that in your own work. If you're interested in any of that, make sure you check out the website. If you want me to talk about your work on this broadcast, I would love to. You can send me images at Dabbleon, Dabbleon, dabbleon@gmail.com, and let me know what you'd like me to talk about or look at, or just let me respond to it and say what I will. And I will. I try not to be too mean about it. I try to be say things that are only productive, or I think that might be helpful to you in understanding how your image is being seen. And I think that's it. Hope you guys have a fantastic week. And hopefully everybody's getting out and about, and we're getting past this isolation that we've been in the past year. And hope everybody's doing well, and hope to see you at the studio. If you can make it to one of these workshops, I'd love to see you. And that's it. Signing off for today. Have a good rest of your day.